In 1763, the people living in the American colonies were proud British subjects. They flew the Union Jack, toasted King George III, and considered themselves loyal Englishmen. Independence wasn't even a thought. But Britain had just finished the brutal 7-year French and Indian War. They gained massive new territory, but also massive debt. To pay it off, Parliament decided to tax the colonists, slapping fees on everything from newspapers and legal documents to glass, paint, and tea. The colonists had zero representation in Parliament, no vote, and no seat at the table to decide how their money was spent. When they protested, King George didn't negotiate. Instead, he sent 4,000 heavily armed soldiers to occupy Boston, a city of only 16,000 people. The tension finally snapped on the night of March 5, 1770. A crowd surrounded a group of British soldiers outside the Boston Custom House. Snowballs and insults flew, until the soldiers fired directly into the crowd, killing 5 civilians in an event that became known as the Boston Massacre. Colonial leaders like Paul Revere made sure every colony saw engravings like this one. They took a localized street riot and packaged it as a brutal, calculated slaughter by the Crown. It was highly effective anti-British propaganda, and it aligned the 13 colonies against their king. 3 years later, colonists disguised themselves and dumped 342 chests of British tea into Boston Harbor. Parliament retaliated with the Intolerable Acts, shutting down the harbor and dissolving local government. In response, all 13 colonies convened the First Continental Congress to speak with a single voice. By April of 1775, the talking stopped. When 700 British soldiers marched to seize colonial weapons and conquer Massachusetts, militias met them. A single shot rang out at Lexington, and by the end of the day, farmers and shopkeepers were firing from behind stone walls, inflicting nearly 300 casualties on the retreating redcoats. The armed conflict had started, but the math was completely lopsided. King George commanded the world's strongest navy, a seasoned professional army, and the wealth of a global empire. The Continental Army was an underfunded, disorganized collection of state militias who barely had enough muskets to go around. To lead them, the colonies chose George Washington. He was a Virginia planter with no formal military training from any European academy. He had never commanded an army larger than a regiment, and his early career was defined by losing more battles than he won. Facing the British war machine with these limited resources meant a traditional, head-on conflict would likely end in a quick surrender. To survive, Washington would have to abandon every standard rule of European engagement. This is the Declaration of Independence, adopted by the Second Continental Congress on July 4, 1776. It was a formal, philosophical severing of ties with the British Crown, declaring to the world that governments exist to serve the people. But it was also a literal death warrant. By signing their names at the bottom, every man in that room was committing high treason. If they lost the war, they would hang. And losing looked like a near certainty. Shortly after the ink dried, the British arrived in New York with an armada of 400 ships and 32,000 soldiers. They crushed Washington's forces at the Battle of Long Island, pushing the Continental Army out of Manhattan and across New Jersey. By December, Washington's army had shrunk to fewer than 3,000 men. They were freezing, starving, and half of them planned to go home when their enlistments expired at the end of the year. The revolution was weeks away from collapse. Washington responded with extreme asymmetric warfare. On Christmas night, in the middle of a freezing nor'easter, he loaded his remaining soldiers into boats and crossed the icy Delaware River. They marched barefoot through the snow and caught the Hessian garrison at Trenton completely off guard, capturing nearly 1,000 soldiers. In pure military terms, it was a minor victory.
But psychologically, it proved that this ragged, beaten-down army could still bleed the enemy. Washington refused to quit, and that sheer resilience kept the rebellion breathing. To actually win, America needed foreign aid, specifically from Britain's old rival, France. But the French monarchy was not going to bet on a losing horse. They demanded concrete proof that the colonists could win a major, conventional battle before committing their troops or their treasury. That proof arrived in the fall of 1777 at Saratoga. American militias swarmed a British army moving south from Canada. Thanks to ferocious, chaotic leadership on the battlefield, most notably by a commander named Benedict Arnold, the Americans surrounded British General John Burgoyne and forced the surrender of his entire force of nearly 6,000 men. Saratoga turned the rebellion into a global conflict. King Louis XVI officially entered the war as America's ally, committing the French Navy, regular infantry, and the massive gold reserves needed to keep the Continental Army in the field. But before that French support could arrive, the Continental Army had to survive the winter of 1777 at Valley Forge. It was a brutally cold season where disease and starvation ran rampant through the log huts, killing roughly 2,000 soldiers without a single shot being fired. Amidst the misery, a Prussian military officer named Baron von Steuben arrived at the camp. He replaced the loose habits of a militia with the synchronized drills of a professional army, standardizing everything from bayonet maneuvers to camp sanitation. When spring arrived, the army that marched out of Valley Forge possessed the unbreakable survival instinct of a partisan militia combined with the lethal, synchronized discipline of a professional military force. By 1781, the war had ground on for 6 years. British General Lord Cornwallis marched 9,000 men to Yorktown, a coastal port in Virginia, expecting the Royal Navy to resupply him. Instead, he walked into a trap. Washington secretly marched his forces 400 miles south, while a French fleet sailed into the Chesapeake Bay, cutting off any escape by sea. Completely surrounded, the British endured 3 weeks of merciless artillery bombardment. American and French cannons pounded the British positions day and night, crumbling buildings and depleting their food supplies. To break the final lines, a young colonel named Alexander Hamilton led a ruthless nighttime assault on the British defensive redoubts. To maintain the element of surprise, his men attacked with unloaded muskets, relying entirely on cold steel bayonets to overwhelm the defenders in the dark. On October 19th, with no supplies and no route of escape, Cornwallis surrendered his entire army. He was so humiliated by the defeat that he sent a subordinate to lay down his weapons before the American and French troops. A collection of underfunded colonial farmers had systematically dismantled the greatest military power on the planet. Washington's 6-year strategy of attrition, combined with a perfectly timed multinational trap, had actually worked. This is the Treaty of Paris, signed in 1783. Look closely at Article 1. With this document, Britain officially recognized the 13 colonies as free, sovereign, and independent states. In the aftermath, George Washington held absolute power. He had the total loyalty of the military and the devotion of the public. If he wanted to seize control and crown himself king of the new nation, no one could have stopped him. Instead, he did something that stunned the entire globe. He walked into the Continental Congress, voluntarily resigned his military commission, and simply went home to his farm in Virginia. When King George III heard that Washington had willingly walked away from absolute power, he reportedly said, "If he does that, he will be the greatest man in the world." By walking away, Washington validated the radical premise of the war, that power in this new nation belonged to the people, and no single leader was above the law.